Well, it's my privilege to introduce Linda Mashburn. I'm pretty sure all of you already know her. She has spoken before. She and Bill have been attending for, she said, about a year and a half. And prior to coming here, she has been a member of various liberal congregations in different parts of the country. She has been active in social justice work. She has been a nurse and a teacher. And so I guess since you know her anyway, that with no further ado, we'll introduce Linda.
Thank you, Mike. We all sang Amazing Grace a few minutes ago, and I assume most of you know that the hymn was written by a slave trader, a captain of a slave ship, who on his conversion to Christianity gave up his trade and spoke out against it. The word conversion is not usually used here at this UU church, though I have to say we used it in our book study group this morning. Nor is being born again, or any of the other terms conservative Christianity uses to describe a time of enlightenment. However, Mike Ivey used the word transition in December to mark a dramatic change in our thinking. We might also speak of transforming experiences or life-changing experiences. I contend that our lives are a series of transitions, conversions, transformations, or episodes of enlightenment, whatever you might prefer to call them. I'm going to talk about a few of my own conversions in the hopes that you will search your own memories for similar episodes of your own. I'm going to start with a basic one for women: awareness of gender roles and the need for liberation. After my sophomore year in college, I was fortunate to go on a delegation to Ghana with Crossroads Africa. Every delegation had a racial mix of students, and my companion that summer was an African-American girl who was a political science major at Vassar. We spent our first week in Ghana as guests at the university, while we learned more about the country, met with various government ministries, and learned how to navigate the local markets. The African students at the university, who were almost all male, sought out my friend to have a conversation about American race relations. This was the summer of 1961, so you can figure out what had and hadn't happened in the United States at that time. After the conversation, my friend came back to see me in the dorm, totally exasperated with the African students she had talked with. She said they just couldn't understand the racism in the U.S. and how Black people could tolerate being treated the way she described. I asked her how she had answered them. She said, quote, "Well, I explained that white people expected Blacks in the U.S. to keep to their historic roles, that as janitors, domestic help, field hands, etc., Blacks were accepted. It was when they tried to change the roles that oppression in its most violent forms occurred." Then she continued, "I explained it was like the roles of women here. As long as African women accepted polygamy, doing all the domestic and agricultural work, letting their husbands and fathers make all the decisions, etc., things were peaceful. She said it was then that the male students exploded, denying these roles for women and vehemently objecting to any comparison with race relations in the U.S. My friend may have lost her argument with the African men, but she opened my own eyes that evening to a better understanding of gender. Perhaps you've had an experience, either growing up or in early adulthood, that opened your eyes to gender issues. Another experience that changed my thinking in several ways was the time I spent in northern India trying to be a missionary. I went to India fresh out of nursing school in my early 20s, thinking I wanted a career as a missionary. But two things happened to me during the 2 years that I was there. The first was that I got caught in an ugly war between India and Pakistan, and our mission hospital sat right on the border with Pakistan, 40 miles from Lahore. The families of our patients quickly moved their sick members to other locations in India, leaving our 200-bed hospital with only 11 unconscious patients. After we sent the student nurses home, we were still left with little work, and the military hospital up the road was getting hundreds of wounded directly from the front. Because while Pakistan invaded Kashmir, the Indian Army advanced on Lahore, bringing in troops, tanks, and equipment through the railroad station right across the street from our hospital. So our staff went up the road to help out at the military hospital. It didn't take me long to decide that I didn't believe in tearing up the human body the way I saw it at the military hospital, especially over territory or ideology. You could say I was converted to pacifism during that experience, that I might have even been able to say in the parlance of the day, I would rather be red than dead. I came back to the United States as an active protester against the Vietnam War. Eventually, I became a charter member of a Quaker meeting, which a number of friends and I formed in 1969 in order to give some young college students at Berea College letters of support in their filing as conscientious objectors. I also came away from that experience aware of how the sale of military hardware promotes violence. Great Britain had supplied all the planes and tanks to the Indian Army, training their troops. And the U.S. had supplied all the planes and tanks to the Pakistani Army, and also provided training to their leaders. It was really strange to me to run for cover when we saw a plane fly over the area with an American flag on the underwing, and to cheer when a plane flew over with the British flag on its underwing. After 3 months of war, both sides in the conflict had lost half their tanks and half their planes. Both the U.S. and Great Britain agreed not to sell either country more planes or tanks, or even the parts to repair the ones they had. So India and Pakistan signed peace accords, and the war was over. Most of you are probably aware that the U.S. is the largest supplier of military hardware in the world. I've forgotten the exact figures, but we supply 3 times the next closest country. I am quite sure that ISIS fights with American-made weapons. My other major learning from the time in India was that I made a reasonably decent nurse, but a lousy missionary. I read Hindu literature while there and experienced the Sikh religion. The most holy Sikh temple was only 60 kilometers away from our hospital, and I visited there several times. Everyone was welcome and could walk through the most holy part of the temple, where their holy book, the Granth, was being read continually. And while there, in the most holy part, receive what I called from my Christian tradition, communion. It was a mound of warm grain sweetened with honey or sugar. You held out your hands just like when receiving the host in a Catholic or Episcopal church. When I first heard the grunt read in an English translation, I asked, what Psalms are they reading? Because the poetry was so similar. I learned that the Sikh religion is monotheistic, like Islam, Judaism, Christianity. The temple had a large covered portico, and anyone who was traveling or homeless could stay under this portico. And everyone who was staying there was provided with at least one big meal a day. So I couldn't help wonder, what am I converting people to? I guess my questions to you are, when did you begin to question our country's military policies? Or have you? You know, were you brought up like I was, to think it might be reasonable to use nuclear weapons against an enemy sometime? Or at what point did you question your inherited religious traditions and practices? Another conversion in my thinking took place with my first trip to Central America in 1985. Amazingly, I had had a good high school history teacher, and I actually knew that the United States had invaded Nicaragua and other Central American countries numerous times between 1850 and 1980. Since Mike Ivy gave his beautiful talk a couple of weeks ago and recounted many of these invasions, I don't feel I need to recount the history again to you. However, the experience of living in a village in Nicaragua that had been attacked by the Contras less than 2 months earlier was a profound emotional experience. The village was actually a cooperative formed by people who had gained some land under the Sandinista government that had come into being in the revolution of 1979. The revolution had been led by the Nicaraguan middle class against the American-backed dictator Somoza. It was not a proletarian revolution, but the poor definitely benefited from land reform measures and the creation of schools and clinics. We were led around the village by a large collection of members, including women and children, everyone pointing out where parts of the Contra attack had happened. The grassy hillside where 2 14-year-old boys died. They were the community's guitar-playing musicians. Where the school had burned. Since it was one of only a few buildings that had been completed in the village before the Contra attack, most of the families were still sort of camping out under a large roof shelter. The village had used the school to store their entire bean crop in one end. And so the bean crop was completely destroyed along with the school. Finally, we were led to a ravine where the 70 children of the village had hidden under trees and bushes during the 3 hours of the attack after fleeing the burning school. As we approached the ravine, the younger children began crying. They didn't want to revisit that place of terror-filled memories. 6 members of the cooperative had died in the attack, and we eventually visited the graves, which included those of the 2 young boys. After touring the village, we were served lunch and then had a lengthy conversation with the leadership of the community, bilingually. Translation going back and forth, Spanish to English and English to Spanish. One of the remarks made by one of the men is a lasting memory. He said, "We know that the United States trains and finances the Contras to attack us because they think we are communists. We don't understand how we are communists. We are Christians who are now able to read the New Testament since the literacy campaign here a couple of years ago, and we learned to read. We know that Jesus teaches us to share with our brothers and sisters and to take care of each other. That's what we do here in this cooperative. We take care of each other. How does that make us communists? He asked. Many fundamentalist Christians have a practice of testifying in their church services in which people stand up and tell their conversion story. Frankly, when I came back from that Nicaraguan experience, I had this urge to testify. And I did find a few opportunities to do so. It's potentially life-changing to meet people who've experienced devastation from the evil empire. If you've had a similar enlightenment, how did it affect you? Or better yet, how does it continue to affect you? Perhaps the biggest area where we white folks need enlightenment is in the area of race or white privilege. I am sure that each of you can probably think of a half a dozen incidents where your thinking has been greatly expanded regarding race. Perhaps the very first one for me was when I was 7 years old and we lived 2 blocks from a large community park in suburban St. Louis. Plans were underway to build a large community swimming pool in that park. And one evening while we were having dinner, a couple of men rang our doorbell. I followed my father to the door to see who was interrupting our supper. The men had a petition they were asking my father to sign. It was a petition to declare the swimming pool a whites-only facility. My father quickly told the men that he wouldn't sign their petition. At that point, they looked at me and said that surely my father wouldn't want me to swim with Negroes. Although they might have used a cruder word than that. My father immediately said, I think it would be fine if she did. Maybe she'd make some new friends. The fact that I remember my father's exact words that evening shows what an impression the encounter made on my 7-year-old understanding. And in fact, during the late 1940s and 1950s, I swam at that integrated pool with a season pass every summer. I also went to integrated schools in the Chicago suburban area when we moved. However, I was still quite naive about many aspects of race in the United States. I'll give a quick example of my naivety. The summer after I finished high school in 1959, I had a summer job working for the Presbyterian Church in Chicago, helping inner-city churches, which were racially mixed, organize vacation Bible school programs and teach in them. I functioned as one member of an interracial team of college students, and another member was an older student from my white suburban church with whom I carpooled to work each day. At the end of every 2-week program, we would have an evening event to which all the parents were invited. So one Friday, several of us brought our swimming suits along, and to fill the hours between the morning school and the evening program, we went swimming at a Chicago public beach along Lake Michigan, and then had pizza together. It was a foursome. We 2 white girls, a Chinese student from Hong Kong, and an African-American student. After the pizza dinner, the African-American girl thanked us profusely for the great time she had enjoyed. I mean, she thanked us repeatedly. On the way home that night in the car, I asked a friend from my church why the girl had been so profuse in her thanks. My friend responded that we'd probably integrated the Chicago beach for the first time, as well as the pizza parlor. I was certainly well aware of the civil rights movement while I was in college and nursing school during the early 1960s, seeing the events on the news, and even spending a couple weeks at Bennett College in Greensboro, North Carolina in 1962, because my women's college had an exchange program with Bennett. This was a year after the first sit-ins in Greensboro, and I met and talked with some Bennett College students who had participated in those sit-ins. Of course, I had some learnings from these experiences, but I can't say that I really became aware of white privilege until my return to America from India in 1966 and went to graduate school in New York City. There I was lucky to have a Professor C. Eric Lincoln, who had gained his PhD in sociology by doing an in-depth study of the black Muslims, and whose best friend was Alex Haley, who helped Malcolm X write his autobiography and then went on to publish Roots. Dr. Lincoln taught me many things through his courses, the many informal conversations with him, and his guidance of my master's thesis. But I think the biggest lesson I took from him is that as a white person, I would never really know what it is like to grow up black in the United States. No matter how sympathetic to the cause of civil rights I might be, I would benefit all my life from being born into a racist society that favored my skin color. So I discovered that this is an area of enlightenment where we never finish the learning curve. It just continues. I want to speak briefly, before I close, about the most recent episode of enlightenment that I experienced. And this relates to the subject of my last talk here a year ago, when I found myself serving 3 months in a federal prison for civil disobedience. I learned something about the American justice system. Of course, I grew up thinking, like many of you probably did, that American justice, at least outside of the very deep South, was reasonably just, that it mainly punished people who committed crimes, and the maxim, innocent until proven guilty, was really how our courts functioned. Now, I had experienced a small crack in that belief by working as a nurse in our public housing communities in Statesville, North Carolina, where I met a number of black families where the woman had served prison time because a relative or boyfriend sold drugs and named the woman as a co-conspirator. However, it wasn't until I was actually in Alderson Federal Prison in West Virginia that I met scores of women who had done almost nothing wrong, but were named as someone as a co-conspirator. What I learned about the conspiracy charge was that it voided the innocent until proven guilty rule. The reality was that if someone named you as a co-conspirator, and you had known them even superficially, you could not really prove you didn't know about their fraudulent practices or actions. Another reality was that the federal government won 97% of its conspiracy cases. So defense attorneys urged people to plead guilty and accept a sentence rather than face a trial, regardless of their innocence or guilt. Consequently, I met many innocent women in prison, and my faith in American justice was destroyed. Does a conversion or an episode of enlightenment affect only our thinking? For the slave trader who wrote Amazing Grace, it meant a major change in how he earned a living. This is because conversion in the Christian tradition is usually linked to another word that's rarely heard in this UU church, and that's repentance. Now, repentance in its original meaning is not just a feeling of being sorry about something. It means a 180-degree turnabout, of living into a complete reversal of that for which one is repenting. So my experiences of conversion, or my episodes of enlightenment, have brought a few changes in my life. And I imagine that your conversion experiences have also changed the course of your lives. And shouldn't they? Shouldn't a whole new understanding change the decisions we make? Sometimes it does cause a change in jobs. We read about one just this morning in our book study about a prison guard who quit his job a few months after a very enlightening experience. Sometimes Our episode of enlightenment causes a change in our social life, or our politics, our church attendance, our relationships, or where we live. Sometimes it's mainly a change in attitude. Of one thing I am sure, and that is that I'm probably not through being converted by new experiences. My thinking and hopefully my behaviors, and yours, will continue to evolve as long as we live. And that's all I have to say.